This morning, we're going to jump into, I don't even know what week we're in. I just know we're talking about parables. And we're in a series called Kingdom Stories because we're talking about the parables of Jesus. The parables are stories, really. They're kingdom stories. They're stories that Jesus told to teach us about his character and about his kingdom. And so we're just taking a look at a different one every week. And so if you have never been here before, or if you've been with us the whole time, you're good. We're all on the same page today because we're starting something brand new. We're going to take a look at a brand new parable. So before we really jump into Matthew 13 for today, I wanted to just take a second and remind us about what parables do for us, because it's a style of teaching that's really unique and that I've honestly kind of fallen in love with the more that I've studied. And so I have a couple of things I want to share with you about just what parables are. And some of them might sound familiar. Really, I just picked my three favorites. So it's not an exhaustive list, but it's the things that I appreciate the most about the parables of Jesus. The first is this. Parables are an invitation to meditate on the words of Jesus. And I know we've already said that, but man, that's important to me. It's important that we think about that because the words of Jesus, the teachings of Jesus, who he said that he was, and what he said the kingdom was, are going to be some of the most, at least for me, they're some of the most valuable things in my life. And when we ask this question, what could the kingdom of God actually look like? It begins to change not only the way that we see God, but the way that we see ourselves. Because something that we believe here at Connection Point, and this is probably going to sound familiar if you've been here for a second, is that as I discover more about God, I discover more about myself. Some of you are like, oh yeah, I've seen that in the little journals out there. Yes, you have. You're not crazy. But we say that because we believe it. That as we take time to discover more about who God is, more about his kingdom, his character, about the things that just that make him different and special and wonderful, we can begin to discover exactly who he has created us to be in this world. And the way that we live, and the way that we interact with others, and the way that we view ourselves and our life changes. And if you've experienced that in this room, then you probably know it's hard to really wrap words around how amazing that is, isn't it? Isn't it? So all of this comes with an invitation to stay curious, because when we stay curious about who God is, it can change our everyday. The second thing I want us to note about parables is this, that parables gently challenge us. And when I first started to type out this slide, I just had the phrase parables challenge us, because they do. They challenge us and they move us to either reject or accept, to either walk away from or to follow Jesus. They work hard to do that. But they do it in a way that's really unique, don't they? Parables have a way of bringing our defenses down just enough so that we can hear the teachings of Jesus in a way that's different. I love that Jesus taught this way. I do. Because as we mentioned a little earlier in the series, I forget which parable we mentioned this, but we mentioned that when Jesus taught, he was teaching to all kinds of different people, right, in different walks of life. He was teaching to some people who loved him and wanted to follow him. And in the very same crowd could have been people who were really unsure, maybe a little skeptical. Maybe they were just interested. Maybe, hey, Jesus is doing healings, so I'm in the crowd, right? Maybe they're not sure where they land. And then there were people in those crowds of people who listened to Jesus' teaching who did not want to have anything to do with what he was saying, who were actually pretty frustrated and angry that Jesus would say the kind of things that he was saying. In parables, what Jesus did for those people, and what I love about him and about the way that he taught, was that instead of, in moments where he could have defended himself, in moments where he could have said, no, you don't understand, this is who I am, what he actually does is he doesn't defend himself, but he works to bring down the defenses of people so that for just a moment, they can maybe catch a glimpse of who he is. So that he can look at them and say, let me tell you a story. And in that story, he reveals the kingdom and the character of God, because it's encountering that will change their lives, right? It's encountering that will change everything. I don't know about you guys in this room, but I do not like to face the weakest parts of me. I don't. Because when I have to face the weakest parts of me, the parts that I know shouldn't be there, I know that I'm going to be moved to change. I know that Jesus will move me to change. And that can be some of the most uncomfortable work I'll ever do, or you'll ever do. But in teaching through parables, Jesus gently challenged people to make decisions about who he was, that he knew would change their life. He did that for the disciples, and he does it for us too. The third thing is this: parables illustrate hope. They illustrate hope. They use simple imagery about things like, plants and seeds and whatever else to teach us like deep, meaningful things about the kingdom. And this morning, we get to look at a parable that illustrates hope by talking about judgment. And I know that might sound like an oxymoron. That might sound kind of crazy. But this morning, we're going to see that Jesus can actually take judgment and wrap hope around it for us. And that's going to be an amazing thing to take a look at. So, are you guys ready to jump in? Yeah? Okay. Let's do that together. We're going to be in Matthew chapter 13, and we're going to start in verse 24. And I'm going to go ahead, and I'm just going to read the entire parable so we can kind of wrap our heads around it together, and then we'll jump in and have our conversation about it. All right. So, verse 24. Jesus told them another parable. The kingdom of heaven is like a man who sowed good seed in his field. But while everyone was sleeping, his enemy came and sowed weeds among the wheat and went away. When the wheat sprouted and formed heads, then the weeds also appeared. The owner's servants came to him and said, "Sir, didn't you sow good seed in your field? Where then did the weeds come from?" "The enemy did this," he replied. The servants asked him, "Do you want us to go and pull them up?" "No," he answered, "because while you are pulling the weeds, you may uproot the wheat with them. Let both grow together until the harvest. And at that time, I will tell the harvesters, first collect the weeds and tie them in bundles to be burned, and then gather the wheat and bring it into my barn." All right, so just as a reminder, as we jump into this parable together, we are doing so through the lens of this question that parables beg us to ask, right? It's, what could the kingdom of God actually look like? And we know that this question is about to get answered because of the way that this sentence starts. In verse 24, it says, "The kingdom of heaven is like." And a lot of parables start that way. The kingdom of heaven is like. And then I want us to see together this morning that the very first thing out the gates that this parable says the kingdom of heaven is like is it's like a man who plants good seed in his field. And what I want us to notice before we go any further is this, that what Jesus cultivates and grows is always good. What Jesus cultivates and grows is always good. And I know that I am standing here talking to a room full of people who your life is not always good, is it? Life is not always good, but man, what Jesus plants, what Jesus puts in our life is always good. The kingdom of heaven is like a man who sowed good seed in his field. And so as the story continues, and I know I'm getting a little ahead of myself, but it's kind of on purpose, because I want us to ask this question over and over again as we have our conversation today. As the story continues, what we're going to learn is that we have to ask ourselves the question, are we willing to be wheat among weeds? Are we willing to live as wheat among weeds? To live like heaven in a world that sometimes is full of hell and evil and sin. And so let's keep going as we contemplate that. Matthew 13, we're going to look at verse 26. It says, "When the wheat sprouted and formed heads, then the weeds also appeared." See, the enemy has sown something that was never supposed to be there, right? The owner's servants came to him and said, "Sir, didn't you sow good seed in your field?" See, these owners are looking at this farmer, right? And they know that he's good at what he does. They know that what he planted is good. And so they're asking the question, well, why does this field look like this then? Why are there weeds here? I know that this isn't what you intended. I know that this isn't what you put here. So they're asking where it came from. Well, this parable tells us that the enemy put it there, right? And I think something I want us to note here is that the enemy has a counterfeit. The enemy has a counterfeit. And I use that word on purpose because as I studied and as I took a look at this parable, I realized that the weeds that it's talking about in this parable is not just like the little dandelions that grow in your grass, you know what I mean? My yard is full of dandelions. I don't know, is anybody else? And those little white, I don't even know what they're called. Those little white fluffy, not the pre-dandelion, I don't know. Clearly I don't know my weed terminology, but, and then like there's the little purple ones that sprout up too all throughout the grass, yes? This parable is not talking about those. What this parable is actually referring to when it talks about weeds among the wheat, it's a specific weed. And I did not even put the scientific name in my notes so that I couldn't try to say it. I'm not going to do it this morning. But it's a very specific weed that's actually called false wheat. False wheat, because it looks so much like wheat. And really, it's hard, even for somebody who, even unlike me, who's somebody who really knows what they're talking about when it comes to wheat and when it comes to weeds, might have a hard time distinguishing the difference between the two, especially when they haven't fully grown. But when they're fully grown, there's subtle differences where you can go, oh, okay, yeah, that's wheat or that's a weed. But until then, it's really hard to tell the difference. But while the visual difference is very subtle, the difference is extreme because the false wheat is actually poisonous. It can be poisonous to humans, to livestock. It is not good. You don't want it in your wheat field. See, the enemy, guys, he has a counterfeit. Not just something, the enemy isn't just dangling something unattractive in front of us to ruin our lives. But he actually promises us things that seem good to our eyes at first, right? Have you guys ever been there where the enemy has presented a way or a path and it looks really good? But the more you go down it, you realize, oh, this is poisonous false wheat, right? This is actually going to do harm if I continue down this way. See, the enemy's had a counterfeit since the very beginning. When we think about the garden and we think about Eve, what did he say? He said, if you eat of this tree, you get to be like God. But Eve was already like God, wasn't she? She was already made in the perfect image of God, called to follow him and to look more like him as the days went on. But what the enemy promised was a counterfeit, and it ended up being poisonous. So, what Jesus plants is good, but there's something in the field that never should have been there. And I want to take just a second here to acknowledge the pain that brings. Because if we think about our world and we think about the consequences of sin and evil in it, it's a painful thing, isn't it? It is. It's unfortunate. But it's where we find ourselves. So, let's keep reading. An enemy did this, he replied. He put something in the field that never should have been there to begin with. But the servants, they ask him a question. It's a good question. They say, do you want us to go and pull them up? It's probably a question that you and I would ask, right? Like, we can fix this. We can figure it out, right? We can get rid of what shouldn't be there. But what does he say? No. He answered, because while you are pulling the weeds, you may uproot the wheat with them. And then he says this, let both grow together until the harvest. See, pulling up those weeds sounds like the quickest way to get a perfectly good wheat field, doesn't it? It seems like the easiest, quickest way to just get back to square one where we need to be. But this field owner knows something that his servants don't know. He knows the merciful way, really. He knows how it should be done and how he sees that it should be done. And so he tells them, let both grow together. And what I want you to hear this morning is this, that the judgment of God is rooted in a deep longing to restore us and our world. It is. His judgment is rooted in a deep longing to restore us and our world. To understand it as anything else, I think, is to misunderstand the heart of God. See, this field is going to have to endure a harvest. But it is because it must be restored to what it was supposed to be. So if you've ever looked around and wondered why there's so much evil in a world that God created, a perfect God created this world, but it is full of so much suffering, isn't it? So much pain. It's because the Lord sowed something that was good, but the enemy came and sowed something very different. And now both are growing together. And it's uncomfortable, and it's chaotic, and it's not really okay, and the Lord knows it. But he also knows the very best way to make sure that that wheat gets taken care of, to make sure that that harvest is exactly what he intended it to be. And it's to let both grow together, as painful and difficult as it might be. So restoration is what comes on the heels of God's judgment. Restoration can come. And we don't get to avoid God's judgment. The next verses are clear about that. But we do get to ask ourselves the question, will we participate in the restoration that Jesus wants to bring to us and to our world? So let's keep reading. Let both grow together until the harvest. At that time, I will tell the harvesters, first collect the weeds and tie them in bundles to be burned, and then gather the wheat and bring it into my barn. See, think about the harvest in the context of this story. Think about the judgment of God, the just judgment of God in the context of this story. There's this field where he planted and created something wonderful, and the enemy did something terrible, and he looks at it and he wants to restore it. See, when you experience suffering and heartache and pain as a result of just being in a world where heaven and hell coexist for now, the Lord sees it and he's not okay with it. He's not okay with it, but he knows that both have to grow together until the harvest. He wants to make a way for things to be made right, and he knows the best way to do it. So, it's important to note that the disciples actually asked Jesus to explain this parable to them. And if we read further down in Matthew, we see that he begins to explain to them what it is that he means by this parable that we're reading today. So I want to go ahead and read those words to you as well, okay? So in the same chapter, Matthew 13, starting in verse 36, it says, "Then he left the crowd and went into the house. His disciples came to him and said, 'Explain to us the parable of the weeds in the field.'" I love that because the disciples were just curious to know, hey, can you explain to us what it is that you're talking about, Jesus? And so they asked him, and he did. And if we keep reading, in verse 37, it says, "He answered, 'The one who sowed the good seed is the Son of Man. The field is the world, and the good seed stands for the people of the kingdom. The weeds are the people of the evil one, and the enemy who sows is the devil. The harvest is the end of the age, and the harvesters are angels.'" And so, man, if one of the disciples really liked note-taking, they were probably like, yes, I could make a chart, right? He just spelled it right out. And so for us, I kind of made, not really a chart, but I put out, okay, this is this and this is that, right? So the sower is the Son of Man, okay? That's Jesus. The sower is Jesus. The field is our world, right? The good seed is kingdom people. What are kingdom people? People who are following Jesus, being changed by him, and then allowing that to impact the way that they live and the way that they treat others. The weeds are people of the evil one. Well, what does that mean? Well, the enemy has a counterfeit way, and there will be people who choose to follow that way. The enemy is the devil, and the harvest is the end of the age. That is when Jesus returns to restore his world. The harvesters are angels. And as I read through that list, I realized that there's a player that's missing, right? There's someone that's missing. Do you guys see it? There's the servants. The servants aren't on this list. And I began to just kind of wonder why. You know, like he listed out what everything was, but he left out these servants. And then I remembered that the disciples are listening. The disciples are listening to Jesus because they're the ones that asked him to explain this parable. And they're probably wondering to themselves, okay, if this is supposed to teach me about the kingdom of heaven and about myself, then where do I land? Where do I fall? Where do I fit in this parable? And I wonder if as they ask themselves that, they realize that maybe they're a lot like the servants who look at the farmer, the sower, and say, hey, do you want us to get in the field and like start pulling? And I began to wonder if the disciples were a little bit like me, because I'm going to tell you guys something about myself this morning. I am a terrible gardener, if you couldn't tell by the way I tried to describe weeds and grass. Yeah? I'm not good at growing anything, and I'm really not good at identifying plants. Now, if like something has like I can identify a tomato plant, like when it has a tomato on it. I'm like, yeah, that's a tomato plant right there, because there's a tomato on it. But like leaves and like, I don't know. I am forever like getting poison ivy, like when I try to walk in nature, because I'm just not good at knowing what's what, okay? I'll be with somebody and they'll say like, oh, that's poison oak over there. Like that's this. And I'm like, oh yeah, but inside I'm like, I'm just not going to touch leaves today. Like that's how we're going to avoid this, because I don't know the difference. I remember one time it was in our first home, and I was so excited that my parents were coming to visit, and they had never seen our home before. And in my kitchen, I had, my kitchen sink, and then right in front of my sink was this big window. And I was so excited for my mom to see, my new kitchen. And I remember she walked in, and I'm standing there, and she looks out my window, and she just starts laughing. Like, just laughing. And I'm like, Mom, what are you laughing at? Like, is there something, like, I don't know. And she's like, what is that? And she's pointing out my window. And I'm like, oh, I don't know. Like, it's some kind of plant. Like, I was like, I've been waiting for it to bloom. Like, I don't know what it is. She was like, honey, that is a weed. And that is the biggest weed I've ever seen in my life. Like, it was above my window. I was like, I don't know. I thought maybe it was a sunflower. And she said, did you plant sunflowers? I was like, no, I didn't. And I'm now realizing that is a weed. So we went out the next day and we pulled it and it was done. But I'm really terrible. At identifying plants. And I wonder if the disciples were anything like me. And I also wonder if, as Jesus told this parable, if what he was trying to teach them was that in the same way that it's really difficult to tell false wheat from wheat, sometimes it's really difficult for us to make judgments about what is good and what is not. And maybe it's like that because it's really not our place. It's really not our place to be the judge. See, the Lord is the just judge, and he will judge the world at the end of the age. He's coming back to do that. He's coming back for a harvest. And so if it's not my job to judge, if I ask, hey, do you want me to pull up the weeds? And the farmer says no, then what is my job? What is my place? How do I fit in all of this? Because certainly I have a part, right? And I wonder if the disciples then thought to themselves, okay, I guess this means that I get to be wheat among weeds. That maybe my job isn't to make judgments about what the end of the age or what the harvest should look like, but maybe my job is to just look into the face of Jesus, look into the face of heaven, and say, whatever you are, whatever you want from me, that's what I want to become. Because when I do that, I become somebody who is a kingdom person, who looks more like heaven, who looks more like Jesus. And that as I live that way on this earth, the world can actually change because the presence of Jesus is changing me and those around me. See, my job is not to figure out what to do with the weeds. The Lord will do that. My job is to be changed by Jesus so that I can be wheat no matter what I'm surrounded by, so that I can look like heaven when I am surrounded by hell. And that's a hard thing to do, isn't it? That is the most beautiful, difficult task any of us will ever do. Because when we make the decision to try our best, to give our all to Jesus, we will still face the evil that exists in our world, because both are growing together, the wheat and the weeds. So let's keep reading in verse 40 of Matthew 13. As the weeds are pulled up and burned in the fire, so it will be at the end of the age. The Son of Man will send out his angels, and they will weed out of his kingdom everything that causes sin and all who do evil. They will throw them into the blazing furnace, where there will be weeping and gnashing of teeth. And then the righteous will shine like the sun in the kingdom of their Father. Whoever has ears, let him hear. Man, these verses, they sound a lot like maybe like the book of Daniel or like Revelation, right? Talking about the end of the age, when Jesus will return. A lot of it sounds, it's imagery, and it's, we see talk about like a blazing furnace or shining like the sun. I think the word here is trying to describe something that's so real but so hard to wrap words around. It's the end of the age when Jesus will restore the world. So the good news is that one day, all of the hell and sin and evil that we experience here will be over. It will be removed. Jesus takes judgment and he wraps it in hope. He takes judgment and he does execute it, but he reminds us that we get to participate in the restoration that can follow it. What an invitation, right? What an invitation. And so there's two takeaways that I want to just remind us of this morning. And then I have two questions too. The first takeaway is this. There is a just judge who loves his world and is totally committed to it. There's a just judge who loves his world and is totally committed to it. Even when we fail to commit ourselves to him, he's committed to us. He is so faithful and good to us. Because God loves his world, he has to judge it. Because in his world, there's something that has been planted that never should have existed, and he has to remove it. He has to restore it. When he looks at the evil that you experience, the pain that surrounds you, he not only sees it, but he's not okay with it. And he is moved to do something about it. But he's going to do it on his terms. And he's going to do it in his way. And we might want to uproot it for him, but he says, no, it's not your job to remove the hell from this world. That's the Lord's job. Our job is to live as wheat among weeds, to grow together until he restores our world. We're invited through the sacrifice of Jesus to participate in the restoration that comes through judgment. And I know that what I'm saying is such a difficult thing. And I know that sometimes doing that is going to take every ounce of you. And even as we have this conversation this morning, to be completely honest, I look out and I see the faces of people who I know some of your stories. And some of you know parts of mine. I've seen the ways that you guys have walked through pain and difficulty. I've answered the phone calls late at night. I've had the coffee meetings over tears, right? I've sat with some of you and I've seen the heartache that exists in your life. And even as I prepared this sermon, if I'm being honest, as I prayed about it, I said, but Lord, what about this? Lord, how am I supposed to share that, you're going to restore us from pain when I know the pain? I can put faces and names and instances to some of it. And the Lord reminded me that he knows it too, that he sees it, that he knows how difficult it is to let both grow together. And then I was reminded of this. Not only have I seen some of your deepest heartaches just as your pastor, but I have seen and I have watched some of you take those terrible moments. I've watched some of you take tragic moments, like painful moments, and give them to Jesus and watch him lift your head out of them. I have watched the way that he has worked in your life to reveal himself in ways that he never could have had we not gone through the pain. And I am not going to pretend to understand all the nuances of that, but here's what I do know. We live in a world where heaven and hell coexist. But through Jesus, we can be people who participate in bringing heaven to earth. And one day, he will restore it all. This is what it means to live as wheat among weeds. And it is, again, the most beautiful, difficult thing I think you'll ever do. The second thought is this, and I really already said some of it. It's that we get to spend our lives figuring out what it means to live like Jesus or heaven, because heaven is wherever Jesus is, isn't it? We get to spend our lives figuring out what it means to live like Jesus, even when we are surrounded by hell. And so as the worship team comes up, I just have two questions for us to consider as we finish our conversation. The first is this: what does it look like to live like Jesus in this moment? And I underlined this moment because really it's a fill in the blank. I don't know everything that's going on in your life. I don't know the moments where you feel like the evil and sin that surrounds, or the pain or difficulty that surrounds our world is the heaviest for you, but you do. And maybe even as I asked this question, you thought to yourself, yeah, I could fill in that blank. Living as wheat among weeds is difficult, but it's what Jesus calls us to. And so what does it look like to live like Jesus in moments of pain and hurt? And again, you can fill in that blank specifically for yourself. And then I have another question, and it's our car conversation. And what that is really the kids, they're learning through the same parable that we're learning in today. They're taking a look at the same portion of Scripture. And so if you're a parent in the room and you're trying to make talking about Jesus normal in your house or on the ride home or whenever, this is a question that you can take with you this week. And again, maybe on the ride home, you just ask, how could choosing to live like Jesus actually change the world around us? I believe that the answer to this question is important because, again, we get to decide if we want to be participants with Jesus in bringing heaven to earth. When we choose to follow him, to be changed by him, and to share his love with the people around us, we're participating in the kingdom of heaven. Come down to earth. And that's what he's called us to. So how could that change the world around us? So today, as we finish up, we are going to sing a song to the Lord. We're going to sing his praise together one more time. And I just want to invite you to consider who he is. To consider that, as you move through this world, as you encounter things in this world that never should have been, darkness and hurt and pain, that he is there with you, that he can be hope, that he can be light, that he can allow you to live in a way that is different, that is new, and that is good. And that one day, he will restore everything. And I have a feeling we'll look back and we'll go, you know what? That was all worth it. That was all worth it. just to be closer to him.